Baby saw a German shepherd being mocked and ignored by everyone. What Baby did next left everyone in tears. What happened next will shock you to your core. The story you are about to listen to will change how you see the world forever. Before we begin, please like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from right now. The morning suncast. Long shadows across Willowbrook Park, but something felt wrong. The usual laughter of children echoed through the air, yet an uncomfortable silence hung over one corner of the playground. 5-year-old Jake tugged at his mother, Sarah's hand, his bright blue eyes scanning the familiar swings and slides with unusual curiosity. "Mama, why is everyone looking over there?" Jake whispered, pointing toward a cluster of adults gathered near the old oak tree. Sarah followed his gaze and noticed the crowd too, their voices carried on the breeze, sharp and judgmental. She couldn't make out the words, but their tone made her stomach twist. Something was happening, and it wasn't good. Jake's small fingers tightened around his mother's hand as they walked closer. The group of adults stood in a loose circle, their backs turned to whatever had captured their attention. Mrs. Henderson from down the street was there, along with Mr. Peterson and several other neighbors Jake recognized from the grocery store. "That thing is dangerous." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Someone should call animal control before it hurts a child. Look at those scars." Another voice added, "Probably been in fights." "These strays are nothing but trouble." Jake's heart began to race. What were they talking about? He stood on his tiptoes, trying to see over the wall of adults, but all he could glimpse were angry faces and pointing fingers. Then he saw it behind the adults, pressed against the base of the oak tree, lay the largest dog Jake had ever seen. The German shepherd's coat was dirty, and matted patches of fur missing in places that revealed pink scarred skin underneath. The dog's eyes were cloudy, and one ear hung at an odd angle, as if it had been torn and never healed properly. But what struck Jake most wasn't the dog's appearance. It was the way the animal held itself, completely still, head low, as if trying to become invisible. The dog's breathing was shallow, and every few seconds it would glance up at the crowd of people surrounding it, then quickly look away. "Mama," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The doggy looked sad. Sarah noticed the pain in her son's voice and knelt down beside him. "Sweetheart, that dog might be sick or hurt. It's best if we stay away." But Jake couldn't look away while the adults continued their harsh discussion. He watched the dog's every movement. The animal wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was scared, terrified, even, and something deep in Jake's chest began to ache. "It's been here for 3 days. Mr. Peterson was saying, "Just lying there staring at people makes everyone uncomfortable. My children won't even play on this side of the park anymore." Mrs. Henderson added, "It's ruining everything." Jake felt tears prick at his eyes. The adults were talking about the dog like it wasn't even there, like it couldn't hear every cruel word they spoke, but Jake could see the dog's ears twitch with each insult, could see how it seemed to shrink smaller with every harsh comment. "Someone threw a stick at it yesterday," a younger man said with a laugh. "Thing didn't even move, just sat there and took it." That's when Jake noticed the small cut above the dog's left eye. Fresh, still slightly red. Someone had actually hurt this animal, and others thought it was funny. "Jake, come on," Sarah said, gently tugging at his hand. "Let's go to the swings." But Jake's feet felt like they were glued to the ground. He couldn't understand why all these grown-ups people he had always thought were kind were being so mean to a dog that was clearly suffering. The German shepherd lifted its head slightly, and for just a moment its cloudy eyes met Jake's bright blue ones. In that instant something passed between them, a recognition and understanding that neither could put into words. The dog's tail gave the tiniest wag, so small that Jake thought he might have imagined it. "Did you see that, Mama?" Jake whispered excitedly. "The doggy wagged its tail at me." Sarah looked, but the dog had already lowered its head again. "I don't think so, sweetheart. Dogs like that don't usually." "It did," Jake insisted. "It knows I'm not mean like them." The crowd was beginning to disperse, their cruel entertainment apparently over for the day. As they walked away, Jake heard fragments of their continued conversation. Should report it to the city. Dangerous animal, like that someone's going to get hurt. But Jake wasn't listening to their words anymore. He was watching the dog, and the dog was watching him, even as Sarah gently pulled him toward the playground equipment. Jake kept looking back over his shoulder. The German Shepherd had lifted its head again and was following Jake's movement with those cloudy but somehow gentle eyes. Mama, I want to give him my crackers, Jake said suddenly, remembering the small package of cheese crackers in his pocket that Sarah had packed for snack time. Absolutely not, Jake, Sarah said firmly. We don't know anything about that dog. It could bite you, but he's hungry, Mama. Look how skinny he is. Sarah did look, and she had to admit that the dog was painfully thin. Its ribs were visible beneath the patchy fur, and its hip bones jutted out at sharp angles, but her protective instincts as a mother overrode her sympathy. I understand you want to help, sweetheart, but it's not safe. Come on, let's play on the slides. For the next hour, Jake went through the motions of playing. He climbed the jungle gym, went down the slide, and even pushed himself on the swings, but his attention kept drifting back to the oak tree where the German Shepherd remained motionless. Other children arrived with their parents, and Jake watched the same scene repeat itself. Parents would notice the dog, pull their children away, and whisper warnings about staying clear of that dangerous stray. One mother even called her child back when the little girl got too close, scolding her loudly enough for everyone to hear. Don't go near that thing, Emma. It looks vicious. But Jake could see what the adults couldn't, or wouldn't. The dog wasn't vicious. Every time someone approached, even aggressively, the animal would lower its head and try to make itself smaller when children threw pebbles or sticks in its direction. The dog didn't growl or snap. It just closed its eyes and waited for the harassment to stop as the morning wore on. Jake noticed something else. The dog hadn't moved from its spot by the tree, not even to find water or shade. A small puddle from the previous night's rain sat just a few feet away, but the animal seemed too defeated to even seek relief from what was obviously severe thirst. Time to go, Jake, Sarah called from the bench where she'd been reading. Jake's heart sank. He couldn't leave the dog like this. What if it was still here tomorrow? What if those mean people came back? What if no one ever showed it kindness? As they walked toward the park exit, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out the small package of cheese crackers. Without saying a word, he broke away from his mother's side and ran toward the oak tree. Jake, no, Sarah called after him, but he was already there. The German Shepherd lifted its head as Jake approached, and for a moment both boy and dog stared at each other up close. Jake could see that the dog's eyes weren't just cloudy, they were filled with a deep, ancient sadness that seemed far too heavy for any living creature to carry. Hi, doggy, Jake whispered, his voice soft and gentle. Are you hungry? The dog's ears perked up slightly at the kind tone, so different from all the harsh voices it had endured over the past few days. Jake slowly opened the package of crackers and held one out in his small palm. The German Shepherd looked at the offering, then up at Jake's face as if trying to determine whether this was some new form of torment, but something in the little boy's expression, the genuine concern, the complete absence of fear or disgust, seemed to reach through the animal's protective walls very carefully, moving slower than Jake had ever seen any dog move. The German Shepherd stretched its neck forward and gently took the cracker from Jake's hand. Its tongue was warm and soft against Jake's palm, and the dog was so careful not. Jake's hand, its tongue was warm and soft against Jake's palm, and the dog was so careful not to accidentally nip the child's fingers. Good doggy, Jake whispered, offering another cracker. You're not mean at all, are you? For the first time in days, the dog's tail gave a real wag, not the tiny movement from before, but an actual wag that seemed to say thank you in the only way it could. Jake, Sarah had reached them and was pulling her son back. What did I tell you about? But she stopped mid-sentence when she saw the look on Jake's face. Her little boy was beaming with pure joy, his eyes bright with tears of happiness rather than sadness. Mama, he's so gentle, Jake said. He didn't try to bite me or anything. He just took the crackers really carefully, like he was trying not to hurt me. Sarah looked down at the German Shepherd, who was now looking up at her with those cloudy eyes. The dog's expression was almost pleading, as if asking her to understand that it meant no harm. Please, Mama, Jake continued. Can we bring him more food tomorrow? He's so hungry and everyone's so mean to him. Sarah felt her heart breaking as she looked between her compassionate son and the obviously suffering animal, but her protective instincts were still stronger than her sympathy. Jake, we can't get involved with stray animals. It's not safe, and we don't know. She was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mr. Peterson was walking back toward them, his face red with anger. What do you think you're doing? He demanded, looking directly at Jake. That animal is dangerous. You could have been hurt. The German Shepherd immediately lowered its head again, its brief moment of hope crushed by the return of hostility. Jake stepped protectively in front of the dog, his small body forming a barrier between the animal and the angry man. He's not dangerous, Mr. Peterson, Jake said with surprising firmness. For a 5-year-old, he's just hungry and sad. That thing is a menace, Mr. Peterson continued. I'm calling animal control first thing Monday morning. Can't have it terrorizing the neighborhood. Jake's eyes filled with tears, but he's not terrorizing anyone. He's just sitting here. Sarah quickly scooped Jake up into her arms, but not before the little boy managed to drop the rest of his crackers near the dog's feet. We're leaving now, she told Mr. Peterson. There's no need for harsh words. As they walked away, Jake kept looking back over his mother's shoulder. The German Shepherd had moved just enough to reach the scattered crackers, eating them with the same careful gentleness. It had shown with Jake's hand, but what Jake saw in the dog's eyes as they disappeared from view would haunt him for the rest of the day. It was the look of an animal that had just experienced a moment of kindness only to have it ripped away again. The look of something that had hoped briefly that maybe the world wasn't entirely cruel that night. As Sarah tucked Jake into bed, he was unusually quiet. She could see the wheels turning in his young mind, could practically feel the weight of his concern for the dog they'd left behind. Mama, he finally said, his voice small in the darkness. What if the doggy doesn't have anywhere to sleep tonight? Sarah's heart clenched. She had been trying not to think about the same thing. I'm sure he'll find somewhere. Safe, sweetheart, but what if he doesn't? What if it rains again? What if those mean people come back and hurt him more? Sarah sat on the edge of Jake's bed, struggling with her own conflicted feelings. Part of her wanted to march back to that park and bring the dog home herself. But the practical, protective side of her knew that getting involved with a stray animal could be dangerous, especially with a child in the house. Jake, I know you want to help, but some situations are too complicated for us to fix. That dog needs help from professionals, people who know how to handle animals safely. But the man said he was going to call the bad people who take dogs away, Jake said, tears starting to flow. What if they're mean to him too? Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She knew that animal control in their small town wasn't known for their gentle handling of strays, especially large dogs with unknown histories. Try to sleep, sweetheart, she whispered, kissing Jake's forehead. Maybe things will look different in the morning. But Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his small bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the German Shepherd. Alone in the park, he thought about the dog's careful gentleness when taking the crackers, about the way its tail had wagged when Jake spoke kindly to it, about the deep sadness in those cloudy eyes somewhere. Around midnight, Jake made a decision. Tomorrow, no matter what his mother said or what the mean adults threatened, he was going back to that park. The doggy needed a friend, and Jake was going to be that friend. He had no way of knowing that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only save the German Shepherd's life, but would also uncover a mystery that had been buried for almost 2 years, a mystery involving stolen dogs, criminal networks, and a heroic animal whose true identity had been hidden beneath layers of abuse and neglect. All Jake knew was that somewhere in the darkness, a gentle soul was suffering alone, and he couldn't let that continue, not when he had the power to help, not when he'd seen the spark of hope in those cloudy eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and revelations that would shock everyone involved, but tonight a little boy's heart was breaking for a dog he'd known for less than an hour, and that compassion would soon prove to be more powerful than anyone could have imagined. The next morning arrived with the kind of brightness that made everything seem possible. Jake woke up before his alarm, his mind immediately jumping to the German Shepherd in the park. He had dreamed about the dog all night, dreams where he brought food and water, where the dog's tail wagged with real happiness, where the mean adults finally understood that the animal wasn't dangerous at all. Mama, can we go to the park today? Jake asked the moment Sarah appeared in the kitchen, even before she'd had her first cup of coffee. Sarah looked at her son's eager face and felt her heart sink. She had hoped he might forget about the dog overnight, but clearly that wasn't going to happen. Jake, sweetie, I thought we could go to the mall today. Instead, there's a new toy store that Just open, but, Mama, what about the doggy? He'll be waiting for me. Jake, that dog isn't waiting for you. It's probably not even there anymore, but Jake's expression told her that he didn't believe that for a second. Please, Mama, just for a little bit. I want to see if he's okay. Sarah knew she was fighting a losing battle. Jake had inherited her stubborn streak, and when he set his mind on something, he didn't give up easily. All right, we can walk through the park on our way to the grocery store. But we're not getting involved, Jake. We're just going to look. Jake's face lit up like Christmas morning. Thank you, Mama. Can I bring him more crackers? Jake, please, just one more package. He was so hungry yesterday. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself nodding. One package, but we're not staying long and we're not bringing him home. 20 minutes later, they were walking through the park entrance. Jake's small hand gripped his mother's tightly, but his eyes were already scanning the area near the oak tree. His heart was pounding with anticipation and worry. What if the dog was gone? What if Mr. Peterson had already called animal control? What if there he is? Jake whispered, tugging on Sarah's hand. The German Shepherd was exactly where they'd left him the day before, still pressed against the base of the oak tree, but something was different. The dog looked even thinner than before, if that was possible. And there were new scratches on his muzzle. Someone had been here. Someone had hurt him again. Jake broke away from his mother and ran toward the tree, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could go. Doggy, I'm back. I brought you breakfast. The German Shepherd lifted his head, and Jake could swear he saw recognition in those cloudy eyes. The dog's tail gave a small wag, and he struggled to sit up straighter, as if trying to look more presentable for his young visitor. Oh no, Jake whispered as he got closer. What happened to your face? There were fresh cuts around the dog's muzzle, and one of his ears was bleeding slightly. Someone had clearly thrown something at him, probably rocks or sticks. Jake felt tears spring to his eyes, but he pushed them back. The doggy needed him to be brave right now. It's okay, Jake said softly, kneeling down just out of reach. I brought you cheese crackers and some of my sandwich from yesterday. Mama said it was okay. The dog watched Jake with careful attention as the little boy opened the package of crackers. This time, instead of just offering one, Jake scattered several on the ground between them. The German Shepherd looked at the food, then up at Jake's face, as if asking permission. Go ahead. Jake encouraged. They're all for you. The dog moved forward slowly, his movement stiff and painful. Jake noticed that he was favoring his left front paw, limping slightly. As he reached for the crackers, someone hadn't just thrown things at him, they'd actually hurt him. Mama, look, Jake called over his shoulder. He's hurt. His paw is bleeding. Sarah had been hanging back, watching from a safe distance, but now she moved closer. She could see the blood on the dog's paw, could see the fresh injuries on his face. Her nurturing instincts, honed by years of taking care of Jake's scraped knees and bruised elbows, kicked in despite her reservations. Oh, you poor thing, she murmured, kneeling down beside Jake. The German Shepherd froze at her approach, his body tensing as if preparing to run or defend himself, but Jake placed his small hand on the dog's shoulder and the animal relaxed slightly. It's okay, Jake told the dog. This is my mama. She's nice. She helps me when I'm hurt too. Sarah was amazed at how the dog responded to Jake's touch and voice. The animal was clearly terrified of adults, but with Jake he seemed to find some measure of peace. What should we call him, Mama? Jake asked suddenly. He needs a name, Jake. We're not just for now, Jake interrupted. Even if we can't keep him, he should have a name. Names are important. Sarah looked at the dog, who was now watching her with those cloudy but somehow intelligent eyes. There was something regal about him, despite his current condition, something that spoke of nobility and strength, hidden beneath the layers of abuse and neglect. How about Rex? She suggested. Jake shook his head. That's too normal. He's special. Look at his eyes, Mama. They're like storm clouds. But nice storm clouds. As if understanding the conversation, the dog tilted his head slightly, studying Jake with renewed interest. Storm, Jake said suddenly. His name should be Storm. The moment Jake spoke the name, the German Shepherd's ears perked up fully. For the first time since they'd known him, his tail began to wag. Not just the tiny movement from before, but a real, genuine wag that made his whole body move. Storm, Jake repeated, and the dog's reaction was even stronger. He actually took a step toward Jake, his cloudy eyes bright with what looked like recognition. That's weird, Sarah murmured. It's almost like he knows that name. But before either of them could think too much about the dog's strange reaction, they heard voices approaching. Jake's heart sank as he recognized Mr. Peterson's angry tone, along with several other adults from the neighborhood. There it is again. Mr. Peterson was saying, "And look, it's got those people's kid with it now. This is exactly what I was worried about." Jake instinctively moved closer to Storm. Placing his small body between the dog and the approaching adult, Storm seemed to sense the danger too. Lowering his head and trying to make himself smaller, "We called animal control," Mrs. Henderson announced. As the group reached them, "They're on their way. That animal is a public menace. He's not a menace," Jake said loudly, his voice shaking with emotion. "His name is Storm, and he's hurt someone, threw rocks at him. Jake, come away from that dog right now," Mr. Peterson demanded. "It's dangerous. Look at those scars. It's obviously been in fights, maybe because people keep hurting him." Jake shot back, his 5-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Sarah put a protective hand on Jake's shoulder. "We were just leaving," she said diplomatically, but Jake shook his head. "No, Mama, we can't leave Storm here. They're going to hurt him more." The animal control truck just pulled up, someone in the crowd announced. "Finally, we can get rid of this problem." Jake's eyes widened in horror as he saw the white van parking near the playground. 2 men in uniforms got out carrying what looked like a long pole with a loop on the end. Jake had seen something like it on a TV show. Once it was for catching animals. "No," Jake cried, throwing his arms around Storm's neck. "You can't take him. He's not bad." Storm seemed to understand what was happening. His body began to tremble, and he pressed closer to Jake as if the little boy was his only protection in the world. "Son, you need to step away from the animal," one of the animal control officers said as he approached. "It's not safe." "He won't hurt me," Jake insisted, his gentle look. To everyone's amazement, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the other half of his sandwich. From the day before, Storm took it from his hand with the same careful gentleness he'd shown, with the crackers, his teeth never even coming close to Jake's fingers. "See?" Jake said, tears streaming down his face. "He's careful. He doesn't want to hurt anyone." But the animal control officers weren't interested in Jake's demonstration. They were here to do a job, and in their experience, large stray dogs were problems to be solved, not animals to be saved. "Ma'am, you need to get your son away from that dog," the second officer said to Sarah. "We need to do our job." Sarah was torn between her protective instincts for Jake and her growing sympathy for the dog. She could see how gentle Storm was with her son, could see the intelligence in the animal's eyes, but she also knew that they were in a difficult situation. "Jake, sweetie, we need to know," Jake cried, holding Storm tighter. "They're going to kill him." "I know they are." The crowd of adults was growing larger, and Jake could hear their whispered conversations. Some were expressing doubt about the dog's supposed danger, especially after seeing how gentle he was with Jake. Others were insisting that the animal needed to be removed regardless. "Look at how calm that dog is with the boy," one woman whispered to her friend. "Maybe it's not as dangerous as we thought." "Doesn't matter," Mr. Peterson said loudly. "It's still a stray, still a health hazard, could have diseases, fleas, who knows what." Storm's trembling was getting worse, and Jake could feel the dog's fear radiating through his small body. The animal was terrified, not of Jake or even of the situation, but of the uniforms. The sight of animal control officers seemed to trigger something deep and traumatic in Storm's memory. "Please," Jake begged, looking up at his mother with desperate eyes. "Can't we take him home?" "Just until he gets better, Jake. We can't." "I'll take care of him," Jake interrupted. "I'll feed him and brush him and everything." "Please, Mama, he needs us." Sarah looked at her son's tear-streaked face, then at the dog, who was now looking at her with what could only be described as pleading eyes. She thought about her own childhood, about the stray cat she'd begged her parents to keep, about how they'd said no, and how she'd cried for weeks afterward. But this wasn't a cat. This was a large unknown dog with obvious trauma and injuries. It could be dangerous, could have diseases, could be too damaged to ever be a safe pet. "Ma'am, we really need to take the animal now," the first officer said, stepping closer with the catch pole. The moment Storm saw the pole, something changed in him. The gentle, passive animal Jake had been comforting suddenly tensed, his lips pulling back in a low growl. But he wasn't growling at Jake or Sarah, he was growling at the officers and their equipment. "See," Mr. Peterson said triumphantly, "I told you it was dangerous. Look at those teeth." But Jake wasn't afraid. He could feel Storm's body trembling beneath his arms. could sense that the dog was terrified, not aggressive. The growling wasn't a threat, it was a plea for help. He's scared. Jake said, his voice surprisingly steady for a 5-year-old. Wouldn't you be scared if someone was coming at you with that thing? The animal control officer paused, struck by the child's words. In his years of doing this job, he'd seen plenty of aggressive dogs, and this wasn't how they behaved. Aggressive dogs didn't tremble and press against children for protection. They didn't take food gently from small hands or wag their tails at kind words. Maybe we should reassess the situation, the second officer said quietly to his partner. The dog doesn't seem to be acting aggressively toward the child. It's still a stray, the first officer replied. Still our job to remove it. But before they could move closer, something unexpected happened. Storm suddenly lifted his head and stared intently at something in the distance. His ears perked up, and he let out a low whine that sounded almost like recognition. What's he looking at? Jake asked, following Storm's gaze, walking across the park. Heading directly toward them was an elderly man in a faded military jacket. He was tall and thin, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, but it wasn't his appearance that caught everyone's attention. It was the way Storm was reacting to him. The dog was struggling to stand up, his injured paw making it difficult, but his whole body was vibrating with excitement. His tail was wagging so hard that his entire rear end was moving, and he was making soft, whimpering sounds that Jake had never heard before. Easy, boy, the man called out as he got closer. Easy now. Storm's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Despite his injuries, despite his fear of the uniformed officers, despite the crowd of people surrounding him, the dog somehow found the strength to pull away from Jake and stumble toward the approaching man. Shadow, the elderly man whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Is that really you? The moment the man said that name, Storm, or Shadow, let out a sound that was part bark, part whine, part cry of pure joy. He reached the man and collapsed against his legs, pressing his head against the familiar hands that were now stroking his matted fur. Oh, my boy, the man said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. What have they done to you? I've been looking for you for so long. The crowd fell silent, watching this reunion with growing amazement. Even the animal control officers lowered their equipment, clearly recognizing that something extraordinary was happening. Sir, one of the officers said, do you know this animal? The elderly man looked up, his arms wrapped protectively around Shadow's neck. This is my partner. His name is Shadow, and he's been missing for almost 2 years. Jake's eyes widened. Your partner? Like for work? The man nodded, his hand never stopping its gentle stroking of Shadow's fur. I'm Thomas Mitchell, retired K-9 officer. Shadow here was my partner for 8 years before I retired. We worked together on the police force, tracking down criminals, finding missing people, stopping drug dealers. The crowd began to murmur with interest and growing respect. This wasn't just any stray dog. This was a police dog, a hero who had served the community. But how did he end up here? Sarah asked, her protective arm still around Jake. Thomas's expression darkened. Shadow went missing 2 years ago, right after I was diagnosed with cancer. I had to go into treatment, and I couldn't take care of him properly. I made arrangements for him to stay with another officer, but he paused, his jaw tightening with anger. The officer claimed Shadow ran away, but I never believed it. Shadow would never just run away. What do you think really happened? Jake asked, his young mind trying to piece together the mystery. Thomas looked down at Shadow, taking in the scars, the injuries, the evidence of prolonged abuse and neglect. I think someone took him, someone who saw a valuable trained dog and decided to make money off him. The animal control officers exchanged glances. They'd seen cases like this before, valuable dogs stolen and sold to illegal fighting rings or puppy mills. Have you reported this to the police? The first officer asked. Countless times, Thomas replied bitterly, but without proof, without knowing who took him or where he's been. There wasn't much they could do. I've spent every day for 2 years searching for him. Jake looked between Thomas and Shadow, his heart breaking for both of them. So Shadow was never really a stray? No, Thomas said, his voice soft. He's always been loved. He's always had a home. He just couldn't find his way back to it. Shadow lifted his head and looked at Jake, his cloudy eyes filled with gratitude. Somehow the dog seemed to understand that this little boy had been the bridge that led him back to his person. If Jake hadn't shown him Kindness hadn't protected him from the crowd, hadn't insisted on calling him by a name that was so close to his real one. This reunion might never have happened. Can Shadow come home with you now? Jake asked Thomas. Hopefully Thomas's expression grew sad. I wish he could, son, but I'm in an assisted living facility now. They don't allow pets, and I'm not in good enough health to take care of him properly. Jake's heart sank after everything they had been through after finding Shadow's real owner. It still might not have a happy ending, but Thomas continued, looking at Jake with new interest. I've been watching you with him. I saw how you protected him, how gentle you were. Shadow trusts you, and that's not something he gives easily anymore. Jake looked up at his mother with hope shining in his eyes. Mama Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She looked at her son, at the elderly man who clearly loved this dog, at Shadow himself, who was now looking at her with those intelligent, pleading eyes. I don't know, she said honestly. It's a big responsibility, and we don't know what kind of care he'll need. I can help with that, Thomas said quickly. I know everything about Shadow, his training, his medical history, his temperament. I can teach Jake how to care for him properly, and I can pay for his medical bills. Thomas added, I've been saving money for 2 years, hoping to find him again. It's the least I can do. Jake held his breath, waiting for his mother's decision. Shadow seemed to be waiting too, his cloudy eyes fixed on Sarah's face as if he understood that she held his future in her hands. The crowd had grown quiet, everyone waiting to see how this incredible story would end. Even Mr. Peterson, who had been so determined to have Shadow removed, was looking uncertain. Now that they knew the dog's true identity, Sarah looked at her son, at the pure love and determination in his young face. She thought about how he'd protected Shadow even when adults had told him it was dangerous, how he'd seen past the dog's rough exterior to the gentle soul underneath. All right, she said finally, we can try it, but there are going to be rules, Jake, and if Shadow needs medical care that we can't provide, or if there are any problems. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake understood, and his face lit up with joy. Thank you, Mama, he cried, throwing his arms around her neck. Thank you, thank you. Shadow's tail was wagging so hard that dust was flying up around him. He looked between Jake and Sarah and Thomas as if he couldn't believe his good fortune. But as the crowd began to disperse and the animal control officers packed up their equipment, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past 20 minutes. None of them saw the 2 men inside watching the scene with great interest. And none of them realized that Shadow's ordeal was far from over. The people who had taken him 2 years ago were still out there, and they had just seen their valuable investment walking away with a new family. The reunion in the park was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous story, and 3 days had passed since Shadow had come home with Jake and Sarah, and already their small house felt completely different. The German Shepherd had claimed a spot by the living room window where he could watch the street, and Jake had made it his mission to help Shadow remember what it felt like to be loved every morning. Jake would wake up early and sit beside Shadow's makeshift bed, whispering stories about his day or reading from his picture book. Shadow would listen with those cloudy eyes fixed on Jake's face, his tail giving small wags whenever the little boy would pause to pet his head. Thomas had been true to his word, visiting every day to help with Shadow's care and to share stories about their time together on the police force. Sarah was amazed by how much the dog remembered from his training despite everything he'd been through. Watch this. Thomas sat on their 3rd afternoon together. He held up his hand in a specific gesture, and Shadow immediately sat his back straight and alert. Despite his injuries, he never forgot his commands. Whoever took him might have heard him, but they couldn't break his spirit. Jake clapped his hands in delight. He's so smart. Can you teach me the commands too, of course? Thomas smiled, but remembered Jake, Shadow isn't just any dog. He's been trained to detect danger, to protect people, to sense things that regular dogs might miss. Those instincts are still there, as if to prove Thomas's point. Shadow suddenly stood up from his resting position, his ears perked and his body tense. He moved to the window and let out a low rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't friendly either. What's wrong, boy? Jake asked, moving to stand beside Shadow at the window. Outside, a black sedan was parked across the street, the same sedan that had been there the day before, and the day before that Sarah had noticed it, but hadn't thought much about it. People parked on their street all the time, but Shadow's reaction suggested something else entirely. That car again, Sarah murmured, joining them at the window. It's been there a lot lately. Thomas's expression immediately grew serious. How long has it been showing up? Since we brought Shadow home, Sarah replied, but I figured it was just someone visiting the neighbors. Thomas studied the car carefully. The windows were tinted. Too dark to see inside, and the license plate was partially obscured by mud. Shadow, what do you think? He asked the dog quietly. Shadow's response was immediate and alarming. He backed away from the window, his body language shifting from alert to genuinely frightened. This wasn't the reaction of a dog seeing strangers. This was the reaction of an animal recognizing a specific threat. We need to call the police, Thomas said without hesitation. The police? Sarah asked, startled. Don't you think that's a bit extreme? It's just a parked car. Sarah, you don't understand what Shadow's been through for him to react like this. Thomas paused, watching as Shadow began pacing nervously around the room. I think the people who took him might be looking for him. Jake's eyes widened with fear. They want to steal Shadow again. I don't know, son, but we're not taking any chances. Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed a number he still knew by heart. Detective Rodriguez, it's Tom Mitchell. I need to report a possible situation involving my former K-9 partner. While Thomas spoke to the police, Sarah kept watching the black sedan as if the people inside knew they were being observed. The car suddenly started up and drove away, disappearing around the corner. They're gone, Sarah said, but Thomas held up a finger, still listening to the detective on the phone. Yes, I understand. We'll be careful. Thank you. Thomas hung up and turned to Sarah and Jake. Detective Rodriguez is going to have patrol cars drive by more frequently, and he wants us to call immediately if we see that car again. But why would someone want to steal Shadow? Jake asked, his small hand resting protectively on the dog's head. He's hurt and old. Thomas sat down heavily in Sarah's armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. Jake, what I'm about to tell you might be hard to understand, but Shadow isn't just any police dog. He was special even among K-9 officers. Special how? Sarah asked, settling onto the couch with Jake beside her. Shadow was trained in narcotics detection, but he was also trained for something else. Tracking specific scents across long distances. He could find people who had been missing for days, sometimes weeks. He had a success rate that was almost impossible to believe. Jake looked above at Shadow, who had finally settled at his feet but was still watching the window nervously. So he's like a superhero dog. Thomas smiled sadly. Something like that. And that kind of training, that level of skill, it's worth a lot of money to the wrong people. What do you mean? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to get a sick feeling in her stomach. Criminal organizations, drug dealers, people who traffic stolen goods. They would pay enormous amounts for a dog with Shadow's abilities, not to use him for good, but to use his training against law enforcement. The room fell silent as the implications of Thomas's words sank in. Shadow wasn't just a beloved pet who had been stolen. He was a weapon that had been taken and was now being hunted. So when Shadow disappeared 2 years ago, Sarah began, I think he was specifically targeted and stolen. Thomas finished, and I think whoever took him has been looking for him ever since he escaped. Jake's eyes filled with tears. But he's safe now. He's with us. Thomas reached over and squeezed Jake's shoulder. We're going to make sure he stays safe, son, but we all need to be very careful. That evening, after Thomas had gone home and Jake was supposed to be asleep, Sarah found herself checking the locks on all the doors and windows. Twice Shadow had positioned himself in the hallway between Jake's room and the front door, as if standing guard around midnight. Sarah was finally drifting off to sleep when she heard Shadow moving around downstairs. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold. Shadow was barking, not playful barking or attention-seeking barking, but the deep, urgent barking of a dog sounding an alarm. Sarah grabbed her phone and crept to the top of the stairs. Shadow was at the front door, his body rigid with tension, barking at something outside. Shadow, quiet, she whispered, but the dog ignored her completely. This was his police training taking over, and he would not be silenced. Sarah crept down the stairs and peered through the living room window. The black sedan was back, but this time it wasn't just parked across the street. It was in her driveway. Her hands shaking, she dialed 911. I need police at 425 Maple Street. Immediately. There's an unknown vehicle in my driveway, and my dog is alerting to danger. Ma'am, are you sure it's not just a visitor? It's midnight, and I don't recognize the car. Please just send someone. Shadows Barking was getting more intense, and now Sarah could hear voices outside, male voices speaking in low tones. They were trying to be quiet, but Shadow's enhanced hearing was picking up every word. "Mama?" Jake's voice came from the top of the stairs. "What's happening?" "Stay upstairs, Jake," Sarah called back, but her son was already coming down, rubbing his eyes sleepily the moment Jake appeared. Shadow stopped barking and moved protectively between the little boy and the door. His training was kicking in. Protect the innocent, especially children. There are bad people outside, aren't there? Jake whispered, wrapping his arms around Shadow's neck. Before Sarah could answer, there was a soft scratching sound at the back door. Someone was trying to get in. "Go back upstairs right now," Sarah whispered urgently to Jake. "Lock yourself in the bathroom and don't come out until I tell you to." But Jake shook his head. "I won't leave, Shadow." The scratching sound continued, and now Shadow was growling low in his throat. His police instincts were fully activated, and he was ready to defend his new family. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We just want the dog. Send him outside and no one gets hurt." Her blood ran cold. Whoever these people were, they had her phone number. They'd been watching her family, learning their routines, planning this. She quickly texted back, "Police on their way." The response came immediately, "No police yet. We're watching. Send out the dog or we come in." Sarah looked at Shadow, who was now positioned in front of Jake like a furry shield. The dog's cloudy eyes were bright with determination, and she realized that he would fight to the death before letting anyone hurt Jake. "Shadow, come here," she whispered. The dog looked at her but didn't move. He wouldn't leave Jake's side. Then she heard the sound she'd been praying for, sirens in the distance, getting closer. The police were coming immediately. She heard urgent whispers from outside, and the scratching at the back door stopped. Car doors slammed, and the black sedan's engine roared to life. By the time the police cars pulled into the driveway, the intruders were gone, but they'd left behind evidence of their presence. Scratches around the back door lock, footprints in the flower bed, and a small electronic device stuck to the underside of Sarah's car. "It's a GPS tracker," Officer Martinez explained as he held up the device. "They have been monitoring your movements, Detective." Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes later, taking photos and collecting evidence. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to be honest with you. These people are professionals. The way they attempted entry, the surveillance equipment, the coordinated timing. This isn't some random crime." "What does that mean for us?" Sarah asked Jake, still clinging to Shadow's side. "It means they're not going to give up easily. They want Shadow back, and they're willing to break the law to get him." Thomas arrived shortly after, having been called by Detective Rodriguez. His face was grim as he listened to the police report. "Tom, we need to know everything about Shadow's disappearance," Detective Rodriguez said. "Every detail you can remember." Thomas sat down heavily, his hands shaking slightly. "I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Shadow was staying with Officer Bradley while I was in treatment. Bradley claimed he let Shadow out in his backyard one morning, and the dog just vanished. No holes in the fence, no gates left open. He was just gone, and you didn't believe it. Shadow would never run away. He's loyal to a fault. Even if he got out accidentally, he would have found his way back or stayed in the area. He wouldn't just disappear." Detective Rodriguez made notes as Thomas spoke. "Did Officer Bradley seem nervous when he reported Shadow missing? Any strange behavior? He seemed, I don't know, guilty, maybe like he wasn't telling me everything, but I was so sick from the chemo that I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have pushed harder for answers." "What happened to Bradley?" Thomas's expression darkened. "He retired early, about 6 months after Shadow disappeared. Bought a house in Florida with cash. Said he'd been saving for years, but police salaries don't usually allow for cash purchases of Florida homes." Detective Rodriguez finished. "Exactly." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You think this Bradley person sold Shadow?" "I think Bradley was paid to make Shadow disappear," Thomas said quietly, "and I think whoever paid him has been looking for their investment ever since Shadow escaped." Jake had been listening to this conversation with growing fear, but also with growing determination. "So they're never going to stop trying to take Shadow?" The adults exchanged glances, none of them wanting to lie to the child, but also not wanting to terrify him. "We're going to catch them, son," Detective Rodriguez said finally, "but until we do, you and your family need to be very careful." "What kind of careful?" Sarah asked. "Via your routines. Don't go to the same places at the same times. Keep Shadow inside unless absolutely necessary." And if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, call immediately." As the police finished their investigation and left, Sarah found herself facing a terrible decision. King Shadow meant putting Jake in danger, but giving him up meant abandoning an innocent animal to people who had already hurt him terribly. "Mama, we can't let them take Shadow," Jake said as if reading her thoughts. "He protected us tonight, now we have to protect him." Sarah looked down at her son, barely 6 years old, but already showing a courage and moral clarity that amazed her. Then she looked at Shadow, who was watching her with those intelligent, trusting eyes. "You're right," she said finally. "Shadow is family now, and families protect each other." But even as she said the words, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were just the beginning. Somewhere out there, dangerous people were planning their next move, and they wouldn't be caught off guard a second time. Shadow seemed to sense her worry. He moved closer to her and rested his head against her leg, a gesture of comfort that spoke volumes about the bond that had already formed between them. "Tomorrow we'll figure out a plan," Sarah whispered, stroking Shadow's head. "But tonight we're all safe." Outside, unbeknownst to any of them, a different car had parked 3 blocks away. The people inside were watching Sarah's house through high-powered binoculars, taking notes on the police response time, the security measures, and the family's routines. They had failed tonight, but they were already planning for tomorrow. Shadow was worth too much money to give up on, and they had invested too much time and resources to walk away empty-handed. The real battle for Shadow's freedom was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the attempted break-in, and life had settled into a new routine of careful vigilance. Sarah had taken time off work to stay home with Jake and Shadow, while Thomas visited daily to help with security planning. And Shadow's continued recovery, the German Shepherd, was slowly regaining his strength, but his training remained sharp. Every morning he would conduct what Thomas called the perimeter check of the house and yard, using skills that had been drilled into him during his police days. Jake had become Shadow's constant companion, learning the dog's commands and even helping with basic training exercises. The bond between boy and dog had grown so strong that Shadow seemed to anticipate Jake's needs before the child even spoke them. But despite their growing sense of family, everyone remained on edge. The police had increased patrols, but Detective Rodriguez had warned them that professional criminals were patient. They would wait for the right opportunity. That opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon when the worst storm in years hit their small town. The rain had started gently around noon, but by 3 o'clock it was coming down in sheets. The wind was howling so loudly that it rattled the windows, and thunder crashed overhead every few minutes. The power had gone out twice already, and Sarah was beginning to worry about flooding. "I need to check on Mrs. Chun next door," Sarah told Jake as another flash of lightning illuminated the living room. "She's elderly, and if her power's out, she might need help." Jake looked up from where he was sitting with Shadow, both of them watching the storm through the window. "Can Shadow and I come with you?" "No, sweetie, this rain is too dangerous, and Shadow shouldn't get his bandages wet. I'll just be next door for a few minutes." Shadow seemed to understand the conversation because he moved closer to Jake, positioning himself protectively beside the boy. Even Thomas, who had been caught in the storm and taken shelter with them, nodded approvingly. "Shadow will keep Jake safe," Thomas said. "That's what he's trained for." Sarah grabbed her raincoat and umbrella, though she doubted they would do much good in this weather. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me. I'll call if there's a problem." The moment Sarah stepped outside, she was soaked. The rain was coming down so hard that she could barely see Mrs. Chun's house, even though it was only 20 yards away. The wind nearly knocked her over twice, and by the time she reached her neighbor's front door, she was completely drenched. Mrs. Chun was fine, but grateful for the company. Her power was indeed out, and she was worried about her cat, Whiskers, who had disappeared somewhere in the house when the thunder started. "I'll help you find him," Sarah offered, though she was anxious to get back to Jake and Shadow inside the house. Jake was curled up on the couch with Shadow reading one of his picture books aloud. The dog seemed to enjoy story time, his ears perking up whenever Jake used different voices for the characters. And then the brave knight rescued the dragon. Jake read, making his voice deep and heroic, because sometimes the dragon isn't really bad, he's just scared and hurt. Shadow's tail wagged and he nuzzled Jake's cheek. As if agreeing with the story's message, thunder crashed overhead so loud that it shook the house both. Jake and Shadow looked toward the window where the rain was hitting the glass so hard. It sounded like pebbles being thrown. Good thing we're safe inside, Jake murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. Thomas was in the kitchen making hot chocolate and checking the battery-powered radio for weather updates. The storm was expected to last for several more hours with possible flooding in low-lying areas. That's when Shadow suddenly stood up, his body going rigid with alertness. His ears were perked forward and he was staring intently at the back door. "What is it, boy?" Jake whispered. Shadow began to growl low and deep. This wasn't the uncertain growl of a nervous dog. This was the warning growl of a trained police animal who had detected a genuine threat. "Mr. Thomas," Jake called toward the kitchen. Shadow's doing his police thing again. Thomas appeared immediately, taking one look at Shadow's posture and facial expression before moving to the window. The storm was so intense that visibility was nearly zero, but Shadow's senses were far more acute than any human's. "What do you hear, boy?" Thomas whispered. Shadow's growl intensified, and he began moving toward the back door with the careful, controlled gait of a dog preparing for action. His police training was taking over completely now. Then they heard it, barely audible over the storm, but definitely there, the sound of someone moving around behind the house. "Jake, go upstairs right now," Thomas ordered quietly. "Take Shadow with you and lock yourself in your bedroom." But Shadow refused to move away from the back door. He had positioned himself in a defensive stance, ready to protect the house and everyone in it. "I'm not leaving, Shadow," Jake whispered. "Jake, this isn't a game." Thomas was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had smashed the small window next to the back door and was reaching through to unlock it. Shadow erupted into action. His police training kicked in completely, and he became the highly skilled canine officer he had once been. He barked with authority, positioning himself between the intruder and Jake. A man in dark clothing pushed through the back door, water streaming off his rain gear. He had a device in his hand that looked like a small remote control, and he was pressing buttons on it rapidly. "Tranquilizer," Thomas muttered, recognizing the device. "Jake, get behind the couch." But Jake didn't move. Instead, he stayed right beside Shadow, his small hand resting on the dog's back. "You can't have him," he shouted at the intruder. "Shadow doesn't belong to you." The man ignored Jake, completely focusing on Shadow. He raised the tranquilizer device, but Shadow was too quick. Years of police training had taught him to recognize weapons, and he moved with lightning speed. The German Shepherd launched himself at the intruder, not to attack, but to disarm. His mouth clamped down on the man's wrist, forcing him to drop the tranquilizer gun. The device skittered across the wet kitchen floor. "Get the dog off me," the man yelled, but his words were lost in the sound of the storm and Shadow's barking. Thomas grabbed the phone to call 911, but the lines were down due to the storm. His cell phone showed no signal either. The weather was interfering with everything. The intruder managed to shake Shadow off and reach for something else in his jacket, but before he could pull out whatever weapon he was going for, another figure appeared in the doorway. Sarah had seen the broken window from Mrs. Chun's house and had run home through the storm. She was soaked and terrified, but she was also furious. Someone was in her house, threatening her son and their dog. "Get away from them," she screamed, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the counter and swinging it at the intruder. The man ducked, but the distraction gave Shadow the opening he needed. The dog lunged forward again, this time going for the man's legs. The intruder lost his balance on the wet floor and went down hard. "Jake, run!" Sarah yelled, but her son was already moving, not away from the danger, but toward Shadow. The 6-year-old threw himself across the dog's back, wrapping his small arms around Shadow's neck. "Don't hurt him," Jake cried. "Please don't hurt him." The intruder struggled to his feet, his face twisted with anger and frustration. He was bigger than any of them and clearly desperate to complete his mission. "Just give me the dog and no one gets hurt," he snarled. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. These people I work for, they don't give up." "Neither do we," Jake said with surprising firmness for a 6-year-old. That's when they heard the sirens. Somehow, despite the storm and the communication problems, help was coming. The intruder heard them too. He looked around desperately, realizing that his careful plan was falling apart. The storm that was supposed to provide cover was now trapping him. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. That dog is worth more money than you can imagine. My employers will be back. Shadow growled one final warning, and the man disappeared into the storm within minutes. Police cars were filling the driveway. Detective Rodriguez and Officer Martinez rushed into the house, followed by paramedics and crime scene technicians. Everyone okay? Detective Rodriguez asked, taking in the scene of broken glass and overturned furniture. We're fine, Sarah said, though her voice was shaking, but they almost got Shadow. Jake was still clinging to Shadow, and the dog was allowing it, understanding that the boy needed the comfort of contact. How did you get through? Thomas asked. The phones were down. Mrs. Chun called from her landline. Officer Martinez explained, said she saw someone breaking into your house during the storm. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for her elderly neighbor, who had risked her own safety to help them. Detective Rodriguez was examining the tranquilizer device the intruder had dropped. This is professional grade, he said grimly, the kind of thing used by veterinarians or animal control, but modified for quick deployment. What does that tell us? Sarah asked. It tells us we're dealing with people who have resources, training, and access to specialized equipment. This isn't some street-level criminal operation. Thomas was studying the broken window and the point of entry. They knew exactly how to get in quickly and quietly. They've been watching this house, learning the layout, and they knew about the storm. Sarah added, they planned this for when visibility would be low and communication would be difficult. Detective Rodriguez nodded. We're going to post officers here around the clock until we can get this resolved. These people have escalated to breaking and entering, which means they're getting desperate. But why is Shadow so important to them? Jake asked. I know he's special, but why do they want him so badly? The adults exchanged glances. This was the question they had all been avoiding, but Jake deserved an answer. Thomas knelt down beside Jake and Shadow's son. Shadow isn't just any police dog. He was part of a special unit that was very successful at stopping bad people from doing bad things. When he disappeared, a lot of cases went unsolved, so they want him to help them be better at being bad, something like that. Shadow knows things, has training that would be very valuable to criminals, but he would never help them. Willingly, Jake's face scrunched up in confusion. But Shadow would never help bad people. He's good, that's right. Thomas said, but they might try to use him anyway, or they might hurt him to keep him away from the police. Sarah saw the fear creep into Jake's eyes and quickly intervened. That's why. We're not going to let them take him. Shadow is part of our family now, and families protect each other. As the police finished their investigation and set up security measures, Sarah found herself making a decision that surprised even her. They couldn't keep living in fear, constantly looking over their shoulders. It was time to take the fight to the people who were terrorizing her family. Detective Rodriguez, she said quietly, drawing him aside. What would it take to catch these people? What do you mean? What if we set a trap, use Shadow as bait, but safely with plenty of backup? The detective studied her face carefully. Mrs. Patterson, that would be extremely dangerous. These people have already shown they're willing to break into your home and threaten your family, and they're going to keep doing it until they get what they want or until they're stopped. Sarah replied, I can't keep Jake living in fear, and I can't keep Shadow locked up like a prisoner. Thomas had overheard the conversation and moved closer. Sarah, I understand what you're thinking, but Tom, Shadow better than anyone if we did this right with proper planning and backup. Could we end this? Thomas looked down at Shadow, who was still staying close to Jake, but was alert and watchful. The dog's police instincts were fully activated, and Thomas could see that. Shadow was ready for action. It's possible, Thomas admitted slowly. Shadow's training is specifically designed for operations like this, but the risk of doing nothing is worse. Sarah said firmly, they almost got him tonight. Next time they might succeed. Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. If we were to consider something like this, it would have to be completely controlled, full surveillance. Backup units, the works, and Jake would be nowhere near it. Sarah added quickly, absolutely not. This would be a police operation, not a family adventure. As they discussed the possibilities, none of them noticed that Jake had been listening to every word the 6-year-old had made his own decision about what needed to happen next. Shadow looked up at Jake as if sensing the boy's determination. What was about to unfold would Test every bond they had formed and every lesson they had learned about courage, loyalty, and protecting the ones you love. But Jake had no way of knowing that the people hunting Shadow had just made their own plans for tomorrow. Night plans that would put everyone he cared about in mortal danger. Comment below if you think Jake should tell the adults what he's planning. Or if sometimes kids have to be brave on their own. The next morning brought an eerie calm after the storm. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the neighborhood looked peaceful and normal, but Jake knew better. He had heard everything the adults discussed the night before, and he understood that the bad people were planning something terrible while Sarah was on the phone with Detective Rodriguez. Finalizing plans for the police operation, Jake slipped upstairs to his room. Shadow followed him as he always did, sensing that something important was happening. "Shadow," Jake whispered, kneeling down so he was eye level with the dog. "I know you understand everything I'm saying. You're the smartest dog in the world." Shadow tilted his head, his cloudy eyes focused intently on Jake's face. "The grown-ups want to use you to catch the bad people, but I heard them talking. They're going to put you in danger, and I can't let that happen." Jake pulled out his small backpack and began packing it with granola bars, a water bottle, and his favorite stuffed animal. "We're going to go somewhere safe until this is all over. Just you and me." Shadow watched Jake pack, and something in the dog's expression suggested he understood exactly what the boy was planning, but instead of seeming worried, Shadow moved closer to Jake as if offering his protection and partnership. "I know where we can hide," Jake continued, his voice getting stronger with determination. "Remember that old tree house in Miller's Woods, the one Mr. Thomas told us about? He said it's been abandoned for years, but it's still sturdy." Shadow's ears perked up at the mention of Thomas's name, but he remained focused on Jake. "If we go there, the bad people won't find us, and the grown-ups won't put you in danger trying to catch them. We'll stay there until it's safe to come home." Jake finished packing and slung the backpack over his shoulders. It was heavier than he expected, but he was determined to carry it. He had to protect Shadow, just like Shadow had protected him. "Come on, boy, let's go." While Mama is still on the phone downstairs, Sarah was deep in conversation with Detective Rodriguez about the details of the police operation. They were planning to stage a fake scenario where Shadow would appear to be alone and vulnerable, drawing the criminals out into the open where police could arrest them. "The operation will take place tomorrow night," Detective Rodriguez was saying. "We'll have units positioned throughout the area, and Shadow will be completely protected." Sarah nodded, though her stomach was churning with worry. Using Shadow as bait felt wrong, even with all the safety measures in place. Meanwhile, Jake and Shadow slipped out the back door and made their way toward the woods behind their neighborhood. Jake had explored these woods many times with Thomas, who had shown him the old treehouse and told him stories about the children who had built it. Decades ago, the walk to Miller's Woods normally took about 15 minutes, but with Jake's heavy backpack and Shadow's still healing injuries, it took almost half an hour. By the time they reached the base of the large oak tree that held the treehouse, Jake was exhausted. "Okay, Shadow," Jake panted, looking up at the wooden structure about 12 feet off the ground. "I'm going to climb up first, and then I'll help you." But Shadow had other ideas. Despite his injuries, the German Shepherd began climbing the wooden ladder that led to the treehouse. His police training had included climbing exercises, and though he was slower than usual, he managed to reach the platform. "Show off," Jake said with a grin, following Shadow up the ladder. The treehouse was exactly as Thomas had described it, old but solid, with walls and a roof that would provide shelter. Someone had even left some old blankets and a few rusty cans of food from years past. "This is perfect," Jake said, spreading out one of the less moldy blankets. "We can stay here until the bad people give up and go away." Shadow explored the small space, his nose working overtime to catalog all the scents and sounds of their new temporary home. When he was satisfied that they were safe, he settled down beside Jake. Back at the house, Sarah had finished her phone call and was looking for Jake to discuss their plans for the day. "Jake," she called up the stairs, "where are you, sweetie?" When there was no answer, she went upstairs to check his room. The moment she saw his empty backpack hook and missing stuffed animal, her heart began to race. "Jake," she called more urgently, checking every room in the house. "Jake, where are you?" Thomas, who had arrived for his daily visit, found Sarah in a state of panic. What's wrong? Jake's gone, Sarah said, her voice shaking. His backpack is missing and so is Shadow. I think he ran away. Thomas immediately understood what had happened. He overheard us talking about the police operation last night he's trying to protect Shadow in the only way he knows how, but where would he go? He's only 6 years old. Thomas was already heading for the door. I have an idea. There's an old treehouse in Miller's woods that I showed him a few weeks ago. He was fascinated by it. They called Detective Rodriguez, who immediately dispatched officers to help with the search, but as they prepared to leave, Sarah's phone rang. The calorie showed an unknown number. Mrs. Patterson, a cold voice said when she answered, "We have a proposition for you." Sarah's blood ran cold. Who is this? That's not important. What is important is that we know your son and the dog are missing. We also know where they are. Thomas grabbed the phone and put it on speaker so Detective Rodriguez, who had just arrived, could hear the conversation. What do you want? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Simple. We want the dog. You bring him to us alone and we'll tell you where your son is if you involve the police. Or try to be clever. The boy disappears forever. Detective Rodriguez was already signaling to his team to start tracing the call. How do I know you're telling the truth? Sarah demanded. How do I know you really know where Jake is? There was a pause, then the voice said, the boy is wearing a red t-shirt and has a blue backpack. He's with a German Shepherd that's missing part of his left ear. They're in a treehouse approximately 3 miles from your house. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. They were watching Jake and Shadow right now. You have 2 hours, the voice continued. Come to the old Miller farm on Route 47. Come alone, bring the dog, and your son will be returned unharmed. Try anything clever, and you'll never see him again. The line went dead. Detective Rodriguez was already coordinating with his team. They're professionals, but they made a mistake. They gave us a location. We have to go get Jake right now, Sarah said, grabbing her car keys. Absolutely not, Detective Rodriguez said firmly. If these people are watching the treehouse approaching, it could put Jake in more danger. So what do we do? Sarah asked. Desperately, Thomas had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. We trust Shadow. What do you mean Shadow is with Jake? The dog would die before letting anything happen to that boy, and Jake is smart. He chose a good hiding place high up, where he can see anyone approaching, as if to prove Thomas's point at that very moment. In the treehouse, Shadow was doing exactly what Thomas predicted. The dog had positioned himself at the edge of the platform, watching the woods below with alert eyes. Jake was sitting behind him, sharing his granola bars with Shadow and talking quietly to keep both of their spirits up. Don't worry, boy, Jake whispered. I know the grown-ups are probably scared, but we're safe here, and when the bad people get tired of looking for us, we can go home. But Shadow's posture suddenly changed. His ears perked forward, and he began to growl low in his throat. Someone was moving through the woods below. Jake crawled to the edge of the platform and peered down through the leaves. 2 men in dark clothing were walking slowly through the trees, looking up at the treehouse. There they are. One of the men said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Just like the boss said. Jake's heart began to pound. How had they found them so quickly? Shadow's growl intensified, but Jake placed a calming hand on the dog's back. Quiet, boy, he whispered. They might not know for sure we're up here. But the men were already circling the base of the tree, looking for the best way to climb up. Kid, one of them called up, we know you're up there. Come down nice and easy and nobody gets hurt. Jake pressed himself against the wall of the treehouse, trying to stay hidden. Shadow positioned himself between Jake and the ladder, ready to defend his young friend. We just want the dog. The second man said, you can go home to your mama after we take him. No, Jake called down, his voice shaking but determined. Shadow belongs with me. The first man started climbing the ladder. Kid, don't make this harder than it has to be. That's when Shadow made his move. The German Shepherd positioned himself at the top of the ladder and let out a bark that echoed through the entire woods. It wasn't just any bark, it was the specific alert bark that police dogs used to call for backup, even though there were no other police officers nearby. Shadow's training kicked in completely. He began barking in a pattern that Thomas would have recognized immediately, the emergency signal that meant officer needs assistance. The man on the ladder hesitated. He had expected to deal with a scared child and an injured dog, not a fully trained police K9 in protection mode just grabbed the dog. His partner called from below, "Boss wants this finished." But as the man reached the top of the ladder, Shadow showed him exactly why. German Shepherds were chosen for police work, moving with speed and precision that belied his injuries. Shadow grabbed the man's wrist in his teeth and held on. The man screamed and lost his grip on the ladder, falling 12 feet to the ground below. His partner rushed to help him, but the fallen man's wrist was clearly injured. "The dog bit me," he yelled. "I think it's broken." Jake watched from his hiding spot, amazed at Shadow's bravery and skill, but he also knew that the men wouldn't give up easily. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered to Shadow. The dog seemed to agree. He moved to the back edge of the treehouse platform where thick branches extended toward another tree. Without hesitation, Shadow jumped across the gap, landing gracefully on the adjoining tree. Jake stared in amazement. "Shadow, I can't jump that far." But Shadow was already working on a solution. He began barking again, this time in a different pattern. Within minutes, Jake heard the sound of sirens in the distance. He called for help. Jake whispered in wonder. Shadow actually called the police. The two men below heard the sirens too and began arguing about what to do. "We need to get out of here," the injured man said, cradling his hurt wrist. "Not without the dog. Boss will kill us if we come back empty-handed." But Shadow had other plans. From his position in the neighboring tree, he began barking again, leading the approaching police directly to their location. Detective Rodriguez was the first to reach the scene, followed by Sarah and Thomas. They found the two criminals trying to climb up to the treehouse while a 6-year-old boy cheered on his canine protector from above. "Jake?" Sarah called up. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mama," Jake called back. "Shadow protected me. He's the best police dog ever." The arrest of the two men happened quickly, but as Detective Rodriguez was reading them their rights, the injured man made a confession that shocked everyone. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "We're just the hired help. The real boss is someone you'd never suspect, someone who has been planning this for 2 years." "Who?" Detective Rodriguez demanded. The man looked around nervously, then whispered a name that made Thomas's face go white with rage. "Officer Bradley. He's the one who has been running this whole operation. He never retired to Florida. He's been right here using his police connections to steal and sell trained dogs." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "That son of a Tom," Sarah interrupted, looking up at Jake, who was still in the treehouse. "Let's focus on getting our boy down safely." Shadow had already solved that problem. The intelligent dog had found a sloped branch that led almost all the way to the ground, providing Jake with a safe way to climb down. When Jake finally reached the ground and ran into his mother's arms, Shadow was right beside him, accepting praise and ear scratches from Thomas. "Shadow saved me, Mama," Jake said, his words tumbling out in excitement. "He fought off the bad men and called the police and everything. I'm so proud of you both," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "But don't you ever scare me like that again." As they walked back toward home, Detective Rodriguez was already coordinating the arrest of Officer Bradley. The corrupt cop's house was raided that evening, revealing evidence of a dog theft ring that had operated across 3 states. But Jake had one more surprise for everyone. As they reached their backyard, he turned to Thomas with a serious expression. "Mr. Thomas, I think Shadow wants to ask you something important." Thomas knelt down beside Shadow, who looked up at him with those intelligent, cloudy eyes. "What is it, boy?" Shadow walked over to Jake and sat down beside him, then looked back at Thomas expectantly. "I think," Jake said with the wisdom that sometimes comes from very young children, "Shadow wants to know if he can stay with us forever, but still be your partner too." Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes as he understood what Jake was suggesting. "You mean share custody like divorced parents do?" Jake nodded solemnly. "Shadow can live with us, but visit you every day. That way he has a family, and you have your partner back." Sarah looked at Thomas hopefully. "What do you think?" Thomas reached out and stroked Shadow's head, thinking about everything they had all been through together. "I think that's the best idea I've heard in 2 years." Shadow's tail wagged so hard that it stirred up a small dust cloud, and Jake threw his arms around both Thomas and the dog. But what none of them knew was that their story was about to take one more incredible turn, one that would make Shadow not just a local hero, but a symbol of hope for the entire community. What do you think Thomas is going to suggest that will change everything for Shadow and Jake forever? 3 months later, Jake stood proudly beside Shadow on the steps of City Hall, both of them wearing matching blue ribbons. The entire town had gathered to witness something that had never happened before in their small community. Mayor Henderson stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying across the crowd of famous police officers and news reporters who had come to witness this historic moment. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, today we honor not just one hero but two. 6-year-old Jake Patterson and Shadow, a retired police K-9, have shown us what true courage and loyalty look like. Jake beamed up at Thomas, who was standing behind them in his old police uniform. Specially pressed for this occasion, Sarah stood nearby, tears of pride streaming down her face as she watched her son accept recognition for his bravery. But this ceremony isn't just about honoring heroes. Mayor Henderson continued, it's about announcing a new program that will change our community forever. The crowd murmured with interest as Thomas stepped forward to the microphone. 3 months ago, Thomas began, his voice strong and clear. Shadow was a broken, lost dog that everyone had given up on. Today, he's about to become something extraordinary. Jake looked up at Shadow, who was sitting perfectly still in his official police posture, but his tail was wagging slightly, a sign that he was happy and content with the support of our police department and the mayor's office. Thomas continued, Shadow is being reinstated as an active K-9 officer, but this time he won't just be working with one partner. Thomas gestured to Jake, who stepped forward with a confidence that would have been impossible just months before. Jake Patterson is officially being named Shadow's junior partner in our new community K-9 program. Together, they'll visit schools, help with community safety education, and show other children that sometimes the most broken things can become the most beautiful. The crowd erupted in applause, but Jake barely heard it. He was looking at Shadow, who had turned his head to meet Jake's gaze. In those cloudy eyes, Jake saw everything he needed to know. They were partners now, officially and forever. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward with a small badge and collar. Shadow, you are hereby reinstated to active duty as K-9 officer, Shadow Community Division. And Jake Patterson, you are officially appointed as junior community safety officer, as the badge was pinned to Jake's shirt and the new collar was placed around Shadow's neck. Something magical happened. Shadow stood up and placed his paw on Jake's shoulder, just like he used to do with Thomas during their police ceremonies years ago. I now pronounce you, Thomas said with a grin, the youngest K-9 team in state history. The crowd's cheers were deafening, but Jake was focused on something else entirely. Shadow was looking at him with eyes that were no longer cloudy with pain and sadness. They were bright, clear, and full of purpose. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Chun approached them with tears in her eyes. Jake, she said, I want you to know that what you did changed more than just Shadow's life. You showed all of us what it means to see past the surface to the heart underneath. Jake nodded solemnly, then brightened. Mrs. Chun, would you like to meet Shadow properly? He's really gentle, and he loves making new friends now. As Mrs. Chun knelt down to pet Shadow, Jake noticed something that made his heart soar. Shadow's tail wasn't just wagging, it was wagging with the same joy and confidence it had shown in the old police photos Thomas had shown him over the following weeks. Jake and Shadow's story spread far beyond their small-town. Videos of their school visits went viral, showing Shadow helping nervous children overcome their fear of dogs, while Jake explained how kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. They appeared on the local news, then the state news, and finally on a national morning show where Jake's simple wisdom about seeing past scars to find the good inside touched millions of viewers. Shadow taught me that sometimes the scariest looking things are just scared inside, Jake told the television host. And when you're kind to scared things, they become brave things. But the most meaningful moment came 6 months after the ceremony, when they received a letter from a child in another state. Dear Jake and Shadow, the letter read, I saw your story on TV. I have a dog that everyone says is mean, but I think he's just sad like Shadow was. Can you tell me how to help him? Jake looked at Shadow, who seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Shadow, Jake said seriously, I think we have more work to do. Shadow's response was a gentle woof that sounded exactly like Yes, From that day forward, Jake and Shadow began traveling to schools and communities across the region, sharing their story and helping other children understand that every creature, human or animal, deserves a chance at love and redemption. Thomas accompanied them on these trips, watching with pride as his former partner and his young friend showed the world what he had always known, that the bond between a child and a dog could change everything. Sarah often marveled at how much their lives had changed since that first day in the park. Jake had grown from a shy 6-year-old into a confident young advocate for animal welfare. Shadow had transformed from a broken, discarded dog into a symbol of hope and healing. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in their community itself. The story of Jake and Shadow had inspired others to look beyond surface appearances, to offer kindness instead of judgment, and to believe in second chances. The dog park where they first met Shadow was renamed Second Chances Park, and it became a gathering place for families and their pets, including many rescued animals who had found new homes. Thanks to Jake and Shadow's example, on the first anniversary of their meeting, Jake and Shadow returned to the oak tree where their story began. Jake had grown taller, but he still had to look up slightly to meet Shadow's eyes. "You know what, Shadow?" Jake said, stroking the dog's head. "I think we were both lost that day, and we found each other." Shadow leaned against Jake's side, the gesture that had become their signature move during public appearances together. They looked out over the park where children were playing, families were laughing, and several rescue dogs were running freely with their new owners. Thomas joined them under the oak tree, carrying a small plaque that would be installed there the following week. "What does it say?" Jake asked. Thomas read aloud, "In memory of all the lost souls who find their way home through love, dedicated to Jake Patterson and K9 Officer Shadow, who showed us that every ending can be a new beginning." Jake nodded approvingly, then looked up at Thomas with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Mr. Thomas, do you think Shadow knows how many people he's helped?" Thomas looked down at Shadow, who was watching a group of children playing with a rescue dog their family had adopted after hearing Jake and Shadow's story. "I think he knows exactly what he's accomplished," Thomas said, "and I think he's proud of his partner." Jake beamed at the word partner. It still gave him chills every time someone used it as the sun set over Second Chances Park. Jake and Shadow walked home together, their matching badges catching the last rays of light. Behind them, Thomas followed at a respectful distance, smiling at the sight of his former partner and the little boy who had saved them all. The story that had begun with a lonely child and a broken dog had become something neither of them could have imagined, a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of second chances, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. But more than that, it had become proof that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change not just one life, but thousands. Jake looked down at Shadow as they reached their front door, ready for tomorrow. Partner Shadow's tail wagged once firmly, and Jake knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. After all, that's what partners do. That day in the park, when a little boy saw past everyone else's fear to find the gentle soul hidden beneath scars and sadness, he didn't just rescue a dog, he rescued a hero who had been waiting for someone brave enough to believe in second chances. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of compassion. Subscribe for more incredible, true stories of courage and hope, and comment below to tell us about a time when you or someone you know gave a second chance to someone who needed it. Your story might inspire the next Jake and Shadow to find each other. Where are you listening from, and what rescue animal has changed your life? We'd love to hear from you.